Well, I don't know what you thought as I was reading Psalm 22, but I think it's possibly the most remarkable of all the Psalms. Its inscription tells us that it's a Psalm of David's, but unlike so many of David's Psalms, there really are no corresponding circumstances in David's life which seem to fit. And in fact, there's an extremity here that just goes beyond, I think, anything that David experienced. Just consider this as an example. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. Dogs have surrounded me. A band of evil men has encircled me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. Now, how should we understand this psalm? Is it just a dramatic invention of David's? And I think clearly not. There is truth here. Psalm 22 is obviously drawing upon some bitter experience of David's, whatever it was. But there is clearly more to it than that. David is a man with prophetic sight. He is inspired by God to see things far beyond his experience or his time. His real words about his real experiences were taken up and what's the word I'm looking for? Intensified, that's it. Intensified by the Spirit of Christ. And that means that in a wonderful way, David is speaking vividly of his greater son. David is speaking of Jesus suffering at Calvary. And I don't think you really need to look too far or too hard to realize that these verses really do match in a remarkable way Christ's suffering on the tree. And in fact, they provide more details of the horror of his suffering than the gospel writers give us. And all this is 1,000 years before. It really is remarkable. Now, I'm not normally very good with alliteration, as I struggle with English generally, but I have 3 T's for you tonight, which I'm very proud of. But they are 3 aspects of Christ's experience at Calvary that are brought out for us here uniquely in Psalm 22. Now, here's the first. This psalm depicts the torment that Christ experienced at Calvary, and in particular, his sense of abandonment. So everything else in the psalm flows from the haunting opening words in verse 1. My God, why have you forsaken me? Now, no doubt David is describing something of his own torment, obviously a time of suffering in his life when he cried out to God repeatedly and there was seemingly no relief, no inner word of consolation, no prophetic word of encouragement, no change in his outward circumstances. In the past, David, as God's anointed king, had always known God's help, and rightly, David expects deliverance from God. Not this time. It's as if God has abandoned him. But David's words take on a profound and a deeper meaning because Jesus spoke them word for word on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? And it was no coincidence. Now, by the time of Jesus' day, Psalm 22 was widely considered in Judaism to be a messianic psalm. And no doubt Jesus knew what it referred to and knowingly fulfilled it and deliberately echoed it. But Jesus was not simply quoting from the psalm, trying to be neat and trying to be clever. This was Jesus' genuine felt experience. David's words were truly the Lord's words. For as the Lord hung on the cross, heaven was silent, and Jesus hung there alone. Now, there's a mystery here, isn't there? Because just before he went to the cross, we're told in John's Gospel that Jesus says to his disciples, and he's told them that they're all going to abandon him. He says, you're going to leave me all alone. Yet I am not alone, for my Father is with me. So I think this is the mystery of the Trinity, that even as the Father was pouring out his wrath upon his Son, yet simultaneously, through his Spirit, he upheld his Son on the cross, enabling him to obey. But that doesn't change how Jesus felt, and it doesn't change what Jesus experienced, this sense of abandonment and desolation. Now, again, we've got to be clear. Jesus didn't cease to be the Son of God on the cross. The Father didn't disown him or cease to love him on the cross. But in another sense, Jesus was forsaken of God because he had been delivered up to the forces of evil by the express will and purpose of his Father. And as he hung on the cross, and as he was mocked and abused by men, the Father didn't respond. Verse 11 in the psalm, it says, trouble is near, and there's no one to help. And in that sense, the Father turned away. No sweet communion that Christ had enjoyed in eternity past. No sweet communion between Father and Son on the cross. And the Father didn't burst forth with fire to destroy Christ's tormentors, to rescue him. So in that sense, Jesus really was forsaken. And he felt it. He felt it acutely, more than any physical pain. And the other pain he experienced pales in comparison, although it was awful. And you'll notice the psalm describes it in vivid detail. The crude insults and mockery in verses 6 to 8. The vicious enemies surrounding him, leering at him in verses 12 to 13 and then verse 20. You often find in the Psalms that the enemies of God's people are given almost a subhuman quality. They're described in animalistic terms. And we get that here. Bulls, lions, dogs, strong, menacing, savage. This is the hostility that Christ faced. And then, of course, we get the excruciating physical agony, don't we, of verses 14 to 15. His bones are out of joint. His tongue is sticking to the roof of his mouth. And then we get the humiliation of verses 17 to 18. His clothes are divided, and gloating people are staring at him, relishing his humiliation. But the very worst of the suffering of Christ is the thing that the psalm begins with, and it's from which everything else flows. That God, the precious Father, had forsaken him in the sense that he'd given him up to agony and to torment. And it's so awful that Jesus asks, why? Why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from the words of my groaning? Now, Jesus asks that, and he knows the answer, because it was a plan that was conceived in eternity past with his Father, that he was going to receive wrath in our behalf. And yet, he still asks why. And it's not a sinful question. It's not a faithless cry of unbelief, because you'll notice Jesus still addresses God as my God. And it's not a sinful cry of bitterness or despair. It's not a cry of ignorance either. Perhaps the best way I can describe it is to say it's a cry of amazement. That the sin of man is so great that it had come to this, that the Father must give up his own precious, innocent Son. And I think also a cry of raw pain, that the Father who loved him so much was not drawing near to relieve his pain. Why? Why, he asks. And I realise that we're treading on hallowed ground here, aren't we? None of us has ever suffered in this manner, and none of us, I think, ever will. And we can't know for sure how the Lord felt. How can we put ourselves in his shoes? We can't. But inspired by God, David depicts something of the forsaking of Christ. And in his own experience of desolation, David is anticipating this greater desolation. So that is a little picture of the torment of Christ. But number two, we see something of Christ's attitude within his torment. We see his trust. Now, again, we're going to start with David because he's the original author. And wherever he is, he's genuinely in the slough of despair. And he's sinking fast. But somehow, he manages to reach out for solid ground. And he does it by, in verses 3 and 4, remembering his forefathers. People like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the patriarchs, who put their trust in the covenant God, and they weren't disappointed. And it's as if that the sense of it is, David says, well, look, I feel disappointed right now. But I remember that these great men of the past, they weren't disappointed. They were always delivered by God and kept by him. So I'm not going to cling to my feelings. I'm going to cling to the truth that they discovered. Their God is my God. And of course, because David's faith wasn't second-hand, because he had enough of his own experience of God, he moves on in verses 9 to 10, and he reflects upon his own experiences, how God had been intimately involved in his life right from the beginning. God had delivered him from the womb for a start, and then he'd provided for David's needs as a helpless baby, and later he'd brought David to a saving faith. And but for God, David wouldn't have lived to the present day, and David knows this. And so as he rehearses God's goodness and his providence, you get the sense in the psalm of David's faith beginning to strengthen, so that in verse 19 he can say, "Oh, my strength," talking to God, "come quickly to help me. Deliver my life from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dogs." Now, you wouldn't pray that, would you, if you thought that God had disappointed you and let you down and wasn't going to help you? And David has no complaint. His faith comes to the fore, he lays hold of God and he trusts, even though he's being mocked for doing so. Now that's David, but he's foreshadowing, isn't he, the greater experience and the deeper and the perfect trust of Jesus on the cross. Now, Jesus could quite easily have echoed verses 9 and 10, because Jesus would have been very aware and mindful of how his Father had superintended his birth as a helpless baby, and how God had guided him through those vulnerable early years when he was learning to walk, when he was a toddler, and how God had given him the Spirit without measure and had empowered his ministry. Jesus would have been very aware of those things. Evidence is that God was with him. But of course, the thing is that Jesus didn't need that memory to strengthen a flagging faith, because his faith never flagged, did it? Jesus didn't need to go on a faith journey at Calvary, because he always trusted wholly in his Father. He was sinless. So where we see David coming to a position of trust in this psalm, we see Jesus always trusting his Father in this psalm. Even though he was despised and forsaken more than any man, he always unwaveringly trusted in his Father perfectly. Consider the words of verse 3. "Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One." Now, that is a tremendous statement of faith. And I think it describes how Jesus on the cross focused on God's holiness, on his justice, who God was. Now, you will know this, that in our day, God's love has kind of been reduced, hasn't it, to something very sentimental, very superficial. It's a kind of indulgent, permissive, sugar-coated kind of love, which means that, God will never say anything critical to me. He'll never make demands. He'll always turn a blind eye. And if that had been Jesus' view of God and God's love, well, Jesus would never have understood why he was hanging on the cross, would he? But Jesus did know why. Jesus knew full well that God's love cannot be divorced from his holiness. Jesus knew that God couldn't extend his love to sinners without their sin being atoned for. Otherwise, God would have stopped being a holy and a just God. So at Calvary, Jesus not only bore the wrath of God, he agreed with it, he affirmed it, and he was pleased to satisfy his Father's holy justice. And therefore, he may not have spoken these words outwardly, yet by his actions on the cross, Jesus affirmed the truth of Psalm 22, verse 3. "You are enthroned as the Holy One." Jesus never stopped affirming, believing, trusting in his Father. And even his enemies saw it, though of course they mocked him for doing so. He trusts in the Lord, let the Lord rescue him. But they spoke better than they knew, didn't they? Because Jesus was rescued in the end, delivered from death by his Father. He rose from the grave. Jesus trusted like no one else ever has. Consider verse 20. This is in the face of death. "Deliver my life from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dogs." Now, I understand in the King James Bible, it has an interesting reading. "Deliver my darling from the power of the dog." And the meaning of the word is apparently the same as that used of Isaac in relation to Abraham, when Abraham was called by God to sacrifice his son, your only son, whom you love, your darling son. Isaac was clearly loved by Abraham, and David was dearly loved by God. And we're dearly loved by God. But the love of the Father for his only begotten, well, that's on another level entirely. Jesus is the eternal darling of heaven, the darling of his Father. And yet the Father gave him up, and Jesus was willing to be given up for the sake of sinners. So he didn't pray for deliverance from the suffering and from death. He simply trusted God. He trusted his Father. Do you remember what he said on the cross? Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Jesus didn't fear death. He trusted that through and beyond it, his Father could and would raise him. And that's the trust of Jesus here. We've seen David's plight. He's a suffering servant of God, and in it we see the greater torment of Christ, the suffering servant. And we've seen the exercise of David's imperfect faith, and through it we see the exercise of Jesus' perfect faith. Torment, trust, and then thirdly and finally we see a little glimpse of Christ's triumph. Now verse 22 marks a turning point in the psalm. The tone and the mood suddenly change, and from suffering and from agony and cries for deliverance, David moves into praise. I will declare your name to my brothers. In the congregation I will praise you. Now the reason for this sudden change is in verse 24. He has not despised or disdained the suffering of the afflicted one. He's not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. So, going back to David for a moment, his cries for help are answered. God has broken the silence. God has drawn near to him again. God has proved himself yet again to be true to his covenant word. And David is full of joy, and he bursts out in praise. And he doesn't keep it to himself. He can't keep it to himself. So he tells his family, he tells his friends, and he speaks out in the congregation, which basically means God's people, similar to the phrase used in Psalm 1, the assembly of the righteous. We can perhaps imagine, can't we, David worshipping at the sanctuary, publicly testifying to God's goodness. Only David does even more than that. The very final verses of the psalm transport us far beyond Israel and far beyond the 10th century BC. They transcend all boundaries. It's as if David says, well, what God has done for me, his suffering servant, is going to be a blessing to countless others. The poor will eat and be satisfied. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will bow down before him. Now, David wasn't arrogant enough to think that his own temporal sufferings could have that kind of effect. This is clearly David, touched by the Spirit of God, looking ahead beyond Calvary itself to the blessings that would come from the death of Jesus Christ. Remember that the Father did not disdain or despise the suffering of his Son. The cross was Christ's glory. Through it, Christ was highly exalted. His perfect obedience, even unto death, was accepted by the Father, and it was therefore effective. It meant that sinners like us, who would otherwise be barred by our sins from ever getting into heaven, can really enter God's presence. And so God gave his Son the victory over sin and death and raised him from the grave. And as Paul says in Philippians 2, Christ has been exalted to the highest place and given the name above every name. But these verses here, they present the true scale of this triumph. And it's off the scale. You see, because of Christ's atonement at Calvary, a vast number of sinners have been forgiven and cleansed and reconciled to God. Not just Jews, not just upright moral people. To get an idea, we're told in Revelation 7, a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, drawn from the past, present, right up to the final moments before Christ comes back. David says, doesn't he, future generations will be told about the Lord. They will proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn. That's giving you an idea of the scope and scale of Christ's triumph on the cross. And do you know, They don't just speak of Christ. We actually hear Christ himself speak. It's not often, is it, we get to eavesdrop on a heavenly conversation. We do occasionally get it in the Psalms, and we do here in verse 22. Because in Hebrews 2, the writer quotes this very verse and attributes it to Jesus. I will declare your name to my brothers. In the congregation, I will praise you. It's a lovely picture of the risen Lord praising his Father in the glory of heaven. And just reminds us that there never truly was a division in the Godhead. Father, Son, and Spirit were always united in the same cause at Calvary. And the Son is going to put all things under the Father's feet and is delighted to give him the glory. Now, the question is, to whom is Christ praising his Father? To the angels? No, to believers. The writer of Hebrews says that Jesus is not ashamed to call us his brethren. And our very presence there in glory redeems sinners. We're the evidence, we're the visual sign of Christ's triumph. And we and all believers from every age will be there to bear witness as Jesus gives all the praise and the glory to his Father. And we will be fellow worshippers with our Saviour. I think in passing that's one reason, isn't it, why we sing hymns and why we worship in church. We don't just sit here and listen to sermons. There's an outbreak of praise and worship. We sing, we make music in our hearts and we sing to the Lord because it's what we were saved to do. And it's what we will one day do forever in eternity. We will give glory and praise to the God who has triumphed on our behalf. And it's a lovely little picture of that, a foretaste of that here in verse 22. And it's just a little picture of the triumph of Christ. The cross was not in vain. The torment was not in vain. And the trust all led to the triumph. And finally, it's no coincidence, is it, that the very final words of this psalm in verse 31 in my NIV Bible are, he has done it. So the psalm begins with Jesus' words on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it ends with a reference to Jesus' final words on the cross. It is finished. He has done it. Apparently the Hebrew word here is the same in meaning as the Greek word used in the New Testament, finished, done. So Christ has done the work. Through the torment, in trust, he's triumphed. He's defeated the power of sin and death. He's exalted in heaven. And that tells us that the really good news is there's nothing we need to do. We do not have to atone for our sins. We do not have to work hard to stay on the road. All we need to do is trust in what he has done and keep on trusting so that one day we will be in that glorious assembly praising God. So those are just a few thoughts really of a wonderful psalm. I mean, I could have done 2 or 3 more sermons on it. There's so much there. But hopefully it will focus our thoughts as we meet around the Lord's table in just a few minutes.